Tonight, I'd like to share with you a little bit of South Carolina history as we study the American Revolution. And probably one of the most iconic historical figures as a warrior, as a leader, is General Francis Marion. And I would go on to say that he is considered to be one of the forefathers of unconventional operations or special operations. Known as the Swamp Fox, his unique fighting style and stealth, as well as his uncanny awareness as he was keenly attuned to the battlefield, coupled with this unorthodox tactical acumen that he had learned while fighting Indians, he and the Marion militia proved to be very effective and really gave the British a hard time and were feared by British everywhere. Known as a Indian fighter or as a guerrilla fighter, he had a truly an uncanny awareness of the battlefield. He played a significant role in defeating the British in South Carolina and actually British forces in North America as a whole. A testament to just how important Marion was to his men is recorded by a British officer who basically changed sides. It says in 1781, Marion and his men were camping on what's now known as Snow's Island in South Carolina, when a British officer arrived to kind of go over a prisoner exchange, to discuss the exchange of prisoners between the British and Marion's men. As one militiaman would recall later, a breakfast of sweet potatoes was over here roasting in the fire. And Marion invited the British soldier, hey, sit down and have some sweet potatoes. And according to this legend that grew out of a much repeated story time and time again, the British officer was so inspired by the hospitality, the resourcefulness, and the dedication of Marion and his men. And despite the lack of adequate provisions and supplies, or even proper uniforms for that matter, that he promptly switched sides and fought for the American cause. Now, you did have one guy who was really determined to capture Francis Marion, and this was a British cavalry Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton. If you've ever seen that movie, The Patriot, which is kind of a take on Francis Marion, although it's pretty much a stretch, Mel Gibson plays the character which you could relate to Francis Marion, and an English actor whose name escapes me at the moment played the British cavalry officer and did a really good job. And that hatred that seemed to exist on screen between Mel Gibson's character and the other actor who was playing the British cavalry officer was pretty much true, because Tarleton, who was ruthless in his attacks, was so determined, and he was thought to be the answer to basically resolve this plight that British forces were facing in the South. Tarleton vowed to hunt Marion down like a dog, but to no avail. And in fact, 26 miles through swampy paths proved to be Tarleton's undoing. You have to keep in mind, before we go any further, back during this time, up until the American Revolution, European armies squared off in line with one another, fighting in accordance with Napoleonic tactics. This idea of fighting in swamps, hiding behind rocks, firing from trees was new to the British, and it was almost considered ungentlemanly-like. So I can imagine that trying to fight through 26 miles of swampy terrain would probably undo any British officer at the time. Tarleton would later exclaim, "As for this damned old fox, the devil himself could not catch him." Because the significance with Francis Marion is the fact that he rarely ever fought head-to-head with the enemy. His militia used stealth and guile, many times defeating forces much larger than theirs, implementing a type of psychological warfare, if you will, convincing British forces that they were outnumbered and they were fighting a far superior number than they possessed. Now, one thing about Marion, and everybody thinks he's kind of this John Wayne-esque type character, and they think of him as this, you know, big armed, big barrel chested commando. But the bottom line is, he was not what you consider to be a John Wayne type figure. He was slight and kind of walked with a little bit of a limp. He was considered very eccentric, and he really didn't get along well with other officers. And I think this had a lot to do because he did not have a strong educational background. Now, while he was physically brave, the tactics were always careful and prudent, and he was far more a better tactician than many picture him. Now, one thing I do need to talk about, there's a big move afoot in the country now to get rid of monuments and to kind of rewrite history and to change things around. And having taught history before, what I try to remind people is this: you can't apply a 21st century standard to those warriors who fought with a different set of standards 250 some odd years ago. Marion was a slave owner, no question about that. He fought a notoriously brutal campaign against Cherokee Indians that by today's standards would bring people screaming of abuse and violating every law of war that you can imagine. If these same standards were applied, some people would even suggest, and we have a college up in Florence, South Carolina, named after Francis Marion, they would probably want to remove his name from the college. But I think what everyone needs to bear in mind is that it was a vastly different time then than it is today. And what this man needs to be remembered for is his soldierly virtue, and that his record in the American Revolution as really one of the first commandos was shaped by what he learned fighting the Cherokee Indians and adopting those tactics to what he would use against the British later. Now, as far as a little bit of bio or a biographical sketch about the man, he's born in Berkeley County, down near Charleston, 1732, on a plantation. And there's not a whole lot that's written about his early life. He wasn't properly educated, but he did, at the age of 15, he signed on to go aboard this merchant vessel, which was headed to the West Indies. And during this trip, legend has it, the ship was sunk, and it was sunk after being struck by a whale, and he and the crew escaped in a lifeboat and basically spent a week adrift at sea before he was actually rescued later on. That would probably cure his desire for travels, and he returned back to the plantation and remained there until the outbreak of the French and Indian War. When the French and Indian War took place, he and his brother signed on his 25th birthday to join the South Carolina militia fighting for the British, and he served under Captain William Moultrie as a lieutenant, where he fought Cherokee Indians and drove them back from their lands using very brutal scorched earth tactics. But this service that he provided against the Indians in the South during the French and Indian War taught him a lot of lessons that were very advantageous to him later on when he fought the British. The Cherokee would use landscape and terrain to their advantage. Same thing special operators do today. Blending in their surroundings, using natural cover. Concealment was very important, using the forest as your redoubt or fortress, if you will. You couldn't hide behind a fort, but you could hide behind cover. And that is what shaped Marion's tactics. The thing is, as he fought, he grew more successful. Even because South Carolina had a strong Tory or loyalist population to the British, he was still very effective. He helped build a couple of forts, particularly Fort Sullivan in Charleston. He served with bravery and distinction there in 1776. And these hit-and-run tactics, much like that of the Indians, infuriated the British. The British were incensed, and they put a large priority to try to stop Marion and his men. One officer wrote, "Our army will be destroyed by these driblets." One British officer was quoted as saying, "Marion's men seem to be everywhere, yet nowhere. Once they'd hit a target, their mounted troops would mount and they would ride off into the swamp, never to be seen again. It was almost like a ghost." After the war, he was elected to serve and served several terms in the state assembly. He died in 1795 at the age of 63, and he's buried down in Belle Isle Cemetery down in Berkeley County, again down near Charleston. In the short time we have, this small band of commandos, if you will, under the command of General Marion, became the epitome of what I like to call a force multiplier for the Continental Army. Marion didn't have a lot of use fighting with the regular army. He didn't get along with a lot of the regular army officers. But his small force was able to tie up vast numbers of British troops far more superior than his own numbers. And he frustrated the enemy increasingly over a 2.5-year period. Because, as I said before, it was almost like a ghost. They faded in and faded out. They lived off the land. They were self-sufficient. And their raid and ambush techniques were their specialties. The good thing about Marion, and what you need to remember, is this little colonel with the limp. He played a huge part in helping America gain her independence. And I consider him to be one of the forefathers of special operations. And as a South Carolinian, it's my pleasure to introduce him to you this evening. Thank you.